Hello everybody, my name is Reese Lindmark and you're listening to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future, where we explore effective altruism, universal basic income, the attention economy, and blockchain. And the first episode concentrated on the attention economy and kind of an overview for that. So in this one, we're going to look at an overview for topics that I'm excited about in effective altruism. And with that, let's get into it. So first off, an introduction to effective altruism and how I understand it. It is essentially a mindset in which we treat all life as equal, in which we quantify the impacts of our actions on the world. So it's a very consequentialist and kind of outcome-focused mindset. And I think about two kind of key aspects of it. The first is in cause selection. And so that means like, how are you spending your time or how are you spending your money? And from that perspective, they usually use something called a QALY, or a quality adjusted life year, to measure impact. And what that means is if you can increase someone's quality of life, that's great. Or if you can increase how long someone lives, that's also great. So that's kind of their one metric that matters within the space. And kind of a additional one version of that is looking at something like extinction of the human race, where you say, hey, if the human race became extinct as a result of something like an artificial superintelligence, then that would lose a lot of QALYs, a lot of quality adjusted life years. So given those two kinds of things and the impact and the outcomes, you can determine, hey, for a given cost or for a given action, how many, what is the outcome of it, and how many like QALYs essentially am I producing for the world. And one other thing to note with this is that it's very quantitatively based. And for me recently, in fact, I was a little bit sad because I learned that I've been a vegetarian for 7 or 8 years, and I learned that the amount that I help the environment through vegetarianism is essentially equal to 1 metric ton of carbon per year. And you can pay this organization called Cool Earth, which is you can pay them $1.34 a year to have the same impact on the world. So honestly, I'm really reconsidering my vegetarianism because of the pain on me as a result of not even eating meat when I could just pay $1.34 to have the same impact on the environment. So that's kind of the cause selection, how effective altruists think about their impact. The second side of things that I personally think is really key to effective altruism is knowing that that happiness is logarithmic with respect to money. And what that means is they're essentially diminishing returns on money with respect to happiness. So the first, after I make around $45,000 in the US, then additional money after that doesn't do much. An additional, $1,000 doesn't do much for my happiness. It essentially levels off. But if I'm not making $45,000 a year, but rather, let's say I'm making, $450 a year, or the equivalent of $450 a year, then an extra $100 would really make a big difference on my happiness. So I think that's another key part of the effective altruist mindset. It's again, data-based and outcomes-based, but I think it is a key way to say, hey, people in developed countries that have lots of money, you're not actually, getting more and more money doesn't actually make you more happy, and therefore you should think about how you can essentially use that money for good. And one final note here is that my Patreon is an example of both of these things. So for the cause selection side, I am essentially promoting effective altruism, and that is the second highest cause rated by an effective altruist organization called 80,000 Hours. So I'm working on, in theory, a very high impact cause. And then secondarily, I am I have an income cap on myself where the first $1,500 goes to me through Patreon, but then after that point, the money gets distributed amongst myself and effective altruist organizations, because I'm aware of that more money doesn't equal more happiness at a certain point. So that's effective altruism in a nutshell. And now I want to go into some of the things that I'm excited to dive into around critiques within the effective altruist mindset, and specifically like critiquing some of the mindsets of effective altruists, of which I would count myself as one. So the first one is, I think that effective altruists think too much about the magnitude of a given action, like how many qualities does this save? And I think that we should think more about the delta, or the change in time, because I think that can have a great impact on the stability of the system, which then has later impact on the magnitude of qualities. So a good example of this is AI short-term versus long-term impacts. There was a good Wired article recently about a conference with the Future of Life Institute, and how a lot of them were talking about the short-term job loss impacts of AI as a big delta that is not a big delta in terms of, it's not a big magnitude in terms of qualities, cost benefit for qualities, but it is a big delta in terms of change of meaning and happiness for people in developed countries whose lives are being, or whose jobs are being taken away by automation and are experiencing technological unemployment. So I think that we really need to think about this question of short-term versus long-term impacts with respect to AI, and that as a way to say, what is the delta of a given, of the qualities here, not just what is the magnitude of the qualities. So that's the first thing that I think about, and I'm excited to dive more into. The second thing is how far we should go with consequentialism, and do the ends always justify the means. And an example of this for me is something like honesty and stealing. And one thing that I think about is not using ad block. So I think using ad block is bad, because if I go onto the internet and I essentially want to consume some content and there's some ads that are next to that content, that is the agreement that has been made. Is the person who made content said, I will let you see my content and I will provide you ads to watch it or to consume it. And if I'm saying, nope, I am going to consume your content, but I'm not going to pay you in the way that you have designated to be paid, you are in essence stealing. You're not stealing very much money, but you're stealing. And I think that making sure that us in the effective altruist community have really, really good means and are kind of playing the game right, I think that would go a long way to showing that we care about that we place high impact on that, and that we're not just purely consequentialist. And honestly, I think that thinking about means more is a long-term consequentialist positive effect. So the other thing that I think about with this, and kind of an example with respect to AI, is this is related to this concept of AI goal setting, and whether we're just thinking about the goals or the ends that AI is using, or whether we're also thinking about the means that AI is using in something like the deep learning and things of that variety. And this is kind of connected to this concept that I talked about last episode around language and the ability for blockchain-based cryptocurrencies to break network effects of something like English, and in the long term to allow us to more easily communicate with AIs. I think that could be a powerful way for us to make sure that the means of the AIs are the means that we want. So, as to say in a nutshell, consequentialism good, but want to make sure we're thinking about the means as well. The third thing that I'm excited to dive more into is this concept of the cost of delay as a way to choose causes. Right now, it's not part of 80,000 Hours' framework. There's solvability and scale and neglectedness, but there's not cost of delay. And I know for me personally that I'm choosing something like promoting effective altruism because I believe that the other causes have low cost of delay. The moment that one of the other causes has high cost of delay, then I would work more on that cause instead of the long-term good of something like promoting effective altruism. The fourth thing that I'm excited to talk about is the negative. I haven't seen too much on the internet around the negative externalities of effective altruism. And I think that, the versions of this, especially when you start to combine it with blockchain, are, if there's a quantified us or a quantified human organism where everything's kind of based around smart contracts that are optimized to do the most good for the human organism, then we might lose some of the power of and some of the humanity, or at least what we thought of as humanity, as us as single entities. So I think that I'd like to dive deeper into effective altruism as an extreme and what some of the negative externalities could be there. So that's one side of things that I'm excited to talk about, is kind of critiques of effective altruism. The second is how blockchain and effective altruism interrelate. So the first thing that I'm excited by is this concept of the outcome and consequentialism, and what is our one metric that matters, and what do we want that metric to look like. So right now, effective altruists think a lot about qualities and think a lot about decreased risk of extinction, and those are both good, especially given our current context. But as we get better and better at that, and as people become, as we're decreasing our risk of extinction, and as people's lives are becoming closer together in terms of their quality of life, I think we'll need to think more from the perspective of John Rawls's original position. And what I mean by that is, so his original position states, you can imagine a bunch of, let's say, 7.5 billion people go into a back room and decide how society operates, then, and what the different ranks of society are, and then after they say go, they had a quote-unquote veil of ignorance over themselves that said, we don't know where you're going to be placed in that society. So you want to make sure that the society is kind of as kind of equal-ish as possible. And so I think that we're going to be able to essentially define our future impact in terms of where people fall on this John Rawls's original position, because there's no right answer here. Some people might want, perfect equality, but for someone like me, I think that it's good to have incentives to move up or down in society, and I also want to be able to help my kids, which is essentially, if I do well, I want to be able to help my kids. And so I think that there's no right answer there in terms of how much one should be able to, how collapsed or expanded society's inequality should be, and I think that the metric for that is essentially how much is one able to help themselves and help their kids. And what I mean by that is it's this concept of generational inertia, which is if you have some rich person or some poor person, how many generations does it go down the line in order for that richness or that poorness to essentially go away, to become statistically insignificant, for a kid below. So it's unlikely to be the case, and I don't want it to be the case that if I am successful and rich or whatever, that I can't provide any of that to my kid. But I also don't want it to be the case that 20 generations down the line, my kids are still experiencing, my great-great-grandchildren are still experiencing privilege as a result of my either previous privilege or success. So this is to say that I think that in the future, our optimal outcome, we will be able to more easily track this all on the blockchain with things like smart contracts. I think that we'll be more easily be able to say where people stand from a generational inertia perspective and from a John Rawls's original position perspective on how much inequality and change over time they think should exist in the world. So that is a way to lead into the second point around transparency and people's kind of their identities on the blockchain. And what I mean by that is you can imagine that someone has a given, I have a generational inertia desire of 2, after 2 generations, I don't want my kids to see the impacts of my labor or whatever. And maybe someone else has a generational inertia desire of 10. And I think that this kind of transparency is something that we're leaning more and more towards with blockchain, especially the blockchain culture, which is which is imbued with transparency. So a good example of this is someone like 21.co, who has on their site and on their profiles, you can see whether a given person is donating the money that they're making to charity. So I think that that's really cool. I think that that's the first step towards what I call a moral persona. And a moral persona you can imagine as this. So there's a self-sovereign identity app called Uport, and Uport is going to have a bunch of different personas, like a financial persona, like connecting to your banks, and it will have a social persona connecting to LinkedIn and Facebook and whatever. And I also think that it could have something like a moral persona, which allows you to see for a given person, have they taken the giving what we can pledge, or how much are they optimizing for themselves or others, how much do they work for good or for bad or whatever. And so you might be able to see this as a result of being able to see the transparent supply chains and transparent transactions as a result of smart contracts. So you could look at someone's life and say, ooh, that person, I know what their smart contract history looks like, I know what their transaction history looks like, and they've generally been working for the greater good, or they've been generally kind of selfish. It's a little bit of a worrying system, perhaps, especially determining what kind of metrics we use. And it's some of that same worry has been, talked about with China's kind of reputation system that they're building. So this is to say, though, that this transparency piece and something like a moral persona is one that I'm excited to see more through blockchain, and I think will incentivize just purely the transparency will incentivize more people to give effectively. The third thing that I'm excited by at the overlap between effective altruism and blockchain is, something like a do-good coin or an effective altruist coin. And what I mean by that is, so right now they have a bunch of these kind of climate change coins, which are ways to essentially incentivize people with cryptocurrency to do good for the environment. So one example here is Solar Coin, and with Solar Coin, you get money. You can mine Solar Coin by verifying transactions on the network, but you can also get Solar Coin by producing solar energy. So it's a way essentially to incentivize people to produce solar energy, because then you'll get Solar Coin in return. So there's a bunch of different climate change coins that exist. And that's kind of a more specific version. You can imagine a more abstracted version, though, of climate change coin, which is just purely like the do-good coin or the effective altruist coin. And what that would be is, just as you can imagine that, climate change is on a cause prioritization list, so too is something like, preventing or diminishing the impacts of an ASI. And so you can imagine someone that was working on that would get like an ASI coin in return. And you can imagine that people that are getting climate change coins and ASI coins, they might be able to exchange them with a effective altruist coin that is essentially the market price to exchange between those two things would be the weighted cause, the weighted importance of the given cause. So if you were working on a really important cause, you could exchange for effective altruist coin at a good market rate because you were working really good, and so you should get some effective altruist coins for the work that you're doing. So this concept of an effective altruist coin is something that a good amount of people are thinking about in this space, and they're starting generally with the specific implementations within things that are easier to track, like supply chains and solar energy. But in general, I'm excited to use something like effective altruist coin as a way not only to put transparency on a given person's profile for how much good they've been doing, but also as a way to incentivize effective altruistic kind of actions. So that is that's kind of related to this other point around early adopters within the blockchain system, and how historically speaking, poor people have not been as desirable early adopters because if you give them a point of happiness value, they can only give you so much money in return. And blockchain is really changing the incentive structures for early adopters with financial incentives for being an early adopter. But right now, there isn't much that's been done to incentivize non-monetary early adopters. And what I mean by that is kind of like an effective altruist coin. You can imagine something like a happiness coin or whatever, where instead of optimizing for monthly recurring revenue or for GDP or for something like that, you are instead optimizing purely for happiness, which is a way to essentially not discriminate against poor or rich people in terms of how much money they can give you for their happiness, but rather just purely how much happiness you provided. So in addition to the effective altruist coin, I see abilities to do things with something like a happiness coin. The final end state of a lot of this might be something like essentially the disintermediation of charities through effective altruist DAOs that are controlled by an AI. And what I mean, and someone like Rhodri Davies has talked about this at the Charities Aid Foundation. And the general concept is, so right now, if I want to just generally give to effective altruism, I can go to like Giving What We Can's effective altruist funds and give money there. But you can imagine the future that there is instead of that centralized entity like Giving What We Can, there's a decentralized autonomous organization or a DAO that has within it, it essentially knows a lot about randomized control trials. It probably has a lot of prediction markets going in kind of a futarchy way for the AI maybe that's operating within it to say, when you give it, $1 for it to say, where should I allocate this dollar as a result of, these randomized control trials and these prediction markets, because I'm trying to optimize for qualities or I'm trying to optimize for good. And so the AI-informed DAO might be able to more effectively distribute effective altruist funds rather than something like Giving What We Can's EA funds. So that's something that I also expect to see in the future is disintermediation of charities through these new AI DAOs. The final point here is that I think we should be, blockchain will change the way in which we allocate scarce capital and time. So I want to make sure we're thinking about that with respect to effective altruism. And so the big overlaps are with scarce capital, we're seeing the disintermediation and unbundling of venture capital as a result of stuff like ICOs. And then we're also seeing, a huge impact in, things like peer-to-peer finance and the ability to connect to the financial unbanked in the world. So those are two big impacts on scarce capital that we're going to see. And then also we're going to see some impacts on scarce attention. And what I mean by that is right now we have something like the time well spent movement, which essentially is trying to say, hey, don't consume as much, don't spend as much time on Facebook because it doesn't make you that happy. But I think I wanted to change more, or I expect it to change more into kind of these future of work realities where we are able to say, hey, are you spending your time well in effective altruistic sense, in a future of work sense, and being able to kind of think about that through these blockchain-enabled kind of distributed systems in the future of work. And the other side of this with the attention economy is not only the outputs in the future of work side, but is also the inputs, and how can we make sure that the content that we're consuming and the things that we're consuming are, have skin in the game and have aligned incentives and are, in an aggressive way. Could I consume things, and could there be curation markets and scaffold markets such that I am, trying to spend my consumption time well for something like effective altruism? So those are the ways that I'm excited to see blockchain and effective altruism kind of interrelate. And the final topic for today is this concept of the concept of these topics that William McCaskill at the Center for Effective Altruism, and the topics that he's excited for people to explore with these individual EA grants. And so the first one of these that I want to talk about is impact investing. And something that I'm excited to see in this space is how much ICOs start to give back to the community. And what I mean by that is right now, people are arguing for ICOs to give more money to something like the Ethereum Foundation. And you can imagine in the future, something like a Pledge 1%, which is a Pledge 1%, which is something that venture capitalists and companies take on, where they pledge 1% of their money to do good for their community. You can imagine something like a Pledge 1%, but for ICOs, and maybe for to either give back to the Ethereum Foundation or to give to effective charities. So I think that will be a way for impact investors to see transparently around which companies they might want to invest in as a result of, they are pledging 1% to the Ethereum Foundation, or they're pledging 1% of their ICO to effective altruism. I think that'll be a way that we'll see impact investing change within the blockchain space. The second thing that William is excited by is these essentially unexplored politics, and what that means is right now there's not too much overlap between effective altruism and politics, but I think especially with something like blockchain, we're going to see in some ways we might see the decentralization of nation states, and as we're working with a distributed power rather than a centralized power, the thing that I'm most worried about is being aware of that delta, that power shift. If you imagine that all the governments just changed like that to be, distributed, decentralized, blockchain-based, local, hyper-local DAO governments, then that would be all the people that were in the old government would be very sad as their power decreased. So I really want to make sure that we are kind of smoothly transitioning from nation state-based centralized power into non-nation state-based decentralized power. And then the third thing that William talked about is, he thought that there was lots of great content already on the internet around a lot of the topics that he was interested by, but there's no one source for them. And I definitely agree with that. And I think that this is just a perfect time for attention economy-based blockchain solutions like scaffold markets and curation markets, where we'll be able to say, hey, if you're a person who wants to learn about effective altruism, there are incentives for people to have made scaffolded content or curated content for people to easily consume that. So that's the final thing that I'm excited by there. Whew. So that is the day. We talked about a bunch of different things that I'm excited by in the effective altruism space. And the one I'm most excited by is something like an effective altruist coin. Also, you'll be able to see there's a link to a Medium post as well on my site, which has other additional projects to explore within this space. And one final note is I will be interviewing people on the podcast soon that are in the effective altruist space. So excited for those conversations to happen to see how they think what the future of effective altruism looks like. And one final note is if you like the show or have any feedback or questions, please check me out on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/RieslandMark. That's /RHYSLINDMARK. And you can go there and either support or check out what I'm doing. So thank you so much for your time, and excited to be back for episode 3 soon. Thanks. Bye.